Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haasz. Tonight's guest is Stephen Rowley of Pitchcombe in Stroud. Stephen has a long life obsession with folklore, folk music, folk dancing, and he joins me tonight to talk about his passion of the cultural heritage and folk traditions of Gloucestershire. So, welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Hello, and thank you for having me, Nick.
You're very welcome. So, if we can, Stephen, if we can start with a bit about your history and how you came to be involved in the folk traditions of Gloucestershire and your beginning of your relationship with the River Severn.
Well, so I started my career really in science, in environmental science and geology. So my first visits to the Severn were on field trips, A-level field trips, and then during my degree and all my work in geology, and so I'm interested in the landscape and the land use and also the processes that made the River Severn. So that was all very interesting to me. And I didn't move here until 91. And by then I had most of my science and engineering career, and I took some time off at that point to go sailing. So I've also got professional sailing qualifications, and I sailed across the Atlantic, and I really wanted to move near the coast, actually. But the closest bit of coast I've got is the River Severn, or the Severn estuary, really. So that's how I got more interested in that, and actually did some sailing, quite a bit of sailing on the Severn, which is a very, very interesting and often quite dangerous place to sail. And so I've done some of that, and the Severn estuary, it's a shifting thing, and I'm quite interested in pilots, and I did some projects, pilot projects a long time back, and so. But at that point, I shifted my focus really onto cultural heritage, and I got a fine art degree down in Bristol, but I was largely using that experience or that expertise in engaging people particularly with their environment. And I use cultural heritage as a way to do that. So looking at what happened, what the horse stories are, what the history is, and then using that as a way to weave people in. And it goes to my own strengths because I love all that history stuff and folklore. And so along the way, I've done quite a lot of things. And I know your family comes from Frampton-on-Severn, and I've done projects in Frampton-on-Severn, community projects. And in fact, in one of them, we built a giant salmon.
Wow.
Yeah, a salmon with legs. So this was for the 1315, the church in Frampton-on-Severn was consecrated, and they wanted to do a 700th anniversary celebration of that church and various other ones that were also consecrated at the same time. It's quite interesting how that came to be. There's about 80 churches that were consecrated that year, or that year and the following year, because the Bishop of Worcester, he wasn't a particularly religious man, and he needed some money because he needed to raise an army. And so in order to raise money, he discovered that he had to be paid if a church wanted consecration. And he went through all of his records and discovered, or got his clerk to go through records, and discovered that there was about 80 churches that hadn't actually been consecrated. So he went round over two years and collected lots of money from all these churches. So it's quite an interesting story. So one of my part of the project was to develop a dedication day. So it's dedicated. The church is dedicated, and a feature of Dedication Day celebrations in late medieval times were giants, processions with giants and beasts. And we know that one of the beasts of the period in other places was a Luce, Luce, and we didn't know what that was. So we had to do a bit of research and discovered it was a pike.
Ah.
And we thought, well, we'll do something similar here, but because the biggest, the most famous fish from this area is the salmon, we made a 20-foot long salmon, and we had a 12-foot high giant of St. Blaise, who was the patron saint of wool workers, and it's wool community around there. So that's how that came about, and we all dressed up and we did medieval dances and sang songs, and we had a procession, and the squire rode on a great horse and things. It was brilliant, and we went all the way down the village green to the church. So that was quite a bit of fun, and yes, and I got quite interested at that time, and well before that, in understanding more about the salmon fishing methods, which I think it's a real pity that those traditional methods have been stopped. And I think, as a traditional craft, they should have been protected. And there's, it's very interesting what's happening at the moment, the lathe fishing methods that are being unearthed in the archaeology of the mudflats further down the Severn estuary. So that stuff's still there. And I think the actual skills should have been preserved. But I don't, because I don't think it would have made much difference to the overall fishing stocks or the stocks of salmon, because it had been quite a small heritage craft industry rather than a major industry. And likewise, the elvers, the elvers were overfished, and obviously that's a big issue. And I do remember, going down to watch the elver fishermen. And I still remember what elvers taste like, but it was overfished, and that made a big impact on the eel stock. So that obviously had to be controlled. So these things come and go, and that's part of the whole business of cultural heritage, is remind people of these things that happened and were part of the history of the place. Yes, so I got quite interested in those things, and along the way, because of my sailing background, I was interested in the boats and the fact that a trow was made, and that trow is now in the museum, I understand, in Ironbridge. But it would have been nice if that trow had been kept on the water, I think. But such is the way of these things. So I've been sailing old ships, old boats, and the old ways of doing things are quite interesting to me. And quite often now, the better ways to do a particular thing. So when you've got I sailed a 1920 schooner across the Atlantic carrying cargo, and some of those ways of doing that haven't changed since then, since Victorian times, because making a sailing ship work like that, it's not something that you can easily modernize the way it works, and because you've got particular forces and power of the wind and what you need to drive the vessel. So there's all kinds of heritage in that field. So after that, I got involved. I've always been involved in folk music, folk dance, folklore, folk tales, and with some friends, in particular Gwilym Davies, who was a folk song collector. We set up a thing called GlosTrad, which is a website, an online archive of folk song and tunes collected from Gloucestershire. And there's not much in the way of folk songs mentioning the River Severn in there. Interesting enough, you'd have thought there would have been, but there's not a great deal. And I found one or two bits actually. When I was just searching back through. There's the Troman's Fall. So the trow is the kind of boat that was used on the river, and the hazards of Severn navigation. The 7th day of February from Bristol we sailed out. Our trow was richly loaded and bound for Worcester port. At 6:30 that very night, it was a dismal sound. Our gallant ship struck on the sand, and 4 of her crew were drowned. Woohoo! And then there's lots of stories about the Troman, and they were notorious for being sort of wreckers and stealing and fighting and drinking and all this kind of stuff, So and poaching as well. I did find another verse, but this was written by Charles Dibdin, who was passing through Gloucester in the probably about the turn of the 19th century, and he wrote a song called the Gloucester Ballad to the tune of Yankee Doodle. I won't sing it though, but I'll tell you. The Severn full of salmon fine enriches low and highland. And then for more variety, you've got a little island, of which I've read a tailor's tale, a dozen verses long, sirs. And may I go to old Harry if it's not a clever song, sirs. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of there's little bits and pieces, and I'm just looking at it from where I live, where the Stroud valleys connect into the Severn Vale, but there's got to be lots of stories as you go up at each section of the river as you go further and further up. They will all have their own bits and pieces of stories, and I think that's particularly interesting. And there's some good ones from down this end. Some of them relate to the actual history that may well have happened, or myth. The myth can myth happen? Yeah, I don't know. There's a story about a giant salmon which carried 2 knights up the river to look out over the land, up to Plinlimmon, the mountain, and look down where the Severn stuck. Well, the flanks of Plinlimmon are the source, is where the source of the Severn is, and these knights saw a great commotion that was happening a lot further down and went and interjected, and then you get there. Entangled with that is the story of King Arthur fighting in Wales and then crossing the River Severn at Over, and then coming down the English side of the Severn and fighting a battle at Camlong Down. So that's quite an interesting Camellan, as it's known, as opposed to Camelot. Camellan Down. So that's quite an interesting one. And there's various odd stories that go back quite a long way. And I mean, I was thinking about this tradition of the lamprey pie. Do you know about the lamprey pie, which was
yes, of course, yeah.
And of course I think it's stopped now, but it went right back to Henry I. Yeah, that's a very old, long tradition of the people of Gloucester sending a lamprey pie to the king on April the 23rd. Interestingly, apparently the last one was exhibited in a shop window for many days in Gloucester before it was sent to London. So it couldn't really been worth worth eating by then, you know. And I gather
I've never fancied a lamprey pie personally.
I don't know. A lot of these things, you know, you look at them, you think, well, I'm not sure I'd eat that. But actually, when it's prepared as food, you know, I mean, I think the same goes for eels, doesn't it? Most people look at an
Yeah.
eel, you know,
I
it's
never
quite.
developed a taste for them. No.
No, I used to eat. I got quite like smoked eel.
Hmm.
Elvers, delicious, absolutely, absolutely delicious. But yeah, so you know, those stories going back that far, you know, with named people in them, the Henry the First, and well, that one we know that those things did happen, that those pies were delivered. So those little snippets, you know, they really, really interest me. But I quite like the way the Severn gets involved in folk tales,
Hmm.
and because we lost and we're losing folk tales all the time, and I think they are, well, they're important in that they are a great source of cultural heritage, you know, enabling things to carry on. There's you know, I went to do a project in a school, and they wanted to do a European project. They wanted to work with. They were working with, I think it's called Comenius projects, where they a group of schools from different countries work together on a common theme, and then bring all that together after a year's work together. And this school, they said, we've decided we're going to do our folk tales, our fairy tales, and we've decided what we want to do. We want to do Mother Goose and Little Red Riding Hood, and they listed off a whole load of these things. French and German and what? They're not English folk fairy tales. No, you know, they came in across in the Grimm's fairy tales, and you know, that was published, and you know, everywhere knows all the Grimm's fairy tales from central, well, Germany and Poland and that sort of area. So she said, haven't we got any fairy tales at all of our own then? I said, we got thousands,
Yeah.
but they weren't printed in Grimm's book, and therefore
Mm.
nobody bothers with them. Whereas we should be looking after them, because look what's happened to the Grimm's fairy tales. Disney has plundered them, and the whole Disney industry is based on the Grimm's fairy
Sure.
tales.
Yeah.
So I said, there's loads, and I know two stories from this village. Now that village was the village of Stone, and then we collected from the children, asking older people in the village, and like we collected a whole load more stories. But I think the two older stories from there actually feature the Severn, and the first, there's a lot of stories about the devil, and the devil was in London, and he got rather tired that everywhere he went, when he met somebody from Gloucestershire, they boasted about how good Gloucestershire was. Gloucestershire is great, I hold, from the Severn Vale to the High Cotswold. Pah! He hated it. And once he heard it just too many times, he says, I'm going to go and I am going to block off the River Severn and flood the entire county. And he got himself a big wheelbarrow and filled it with earth, and he set off across the country, heading west. And he walked and he walked and he walked and he walked, and he was getting tired. And he's thinking, am I ever going to come to this so-called great county with this so-called great river? And eventually he saw an old man sitting by the road, and he said, how far is it, my good man, to the River Severn and Gloucestershire? And well, the man sitting by the road, well, he was a cobbler, a travelling cobbler, and he was just having a rest. And he looked this character up and down, and he thought, well, he's a very strange man demanding this information. Should I give him the information or not? And just as he was making his decision, he saw under the coat of the gentleman from London with the wheelbarrow, he saw a twitch and he thought, that looks like a tail. And actually, under his hat, he looks like he might have a couple of little bumps. This is the devil I'm talking to here. So I shall not tell him how far it is. And he said, oh, you've got a long way to go till you reach the River Severn. I would say a couple of days' walk. Look, I've worn out all these shoes just walking from the Severn to get here. And he tipped up his sack and he opened, out fell all these worn out shoes that he was there to repair. Well, the devil was so annoyed, so angry, he stomped on a few extra miles and tipped up the barrow and left a great conical mound of earth that we now know as Cam Peak, the hill that's just outside Cam, and just a few miles short of the River Severn. And he knew not that he was in Gloucestershire all along. And that's a typical sort of outwitting the devil kind of story. And in a way, it's a bit like those old stories telling you why things are like they are, why Cam Peak is there, why it's like that. And there's another story about, there's lots of stories about Jack. And Jack really represents every man. And in some cases, he's called Jack of so-and-so, Jack of whatever, Jack of Kent, Jack of York, or whatever. And anyway, Jack was in a pub up in the Forest of Dean, high up on the edge of the valley. And he was having a drink with his friends when the door opened and a man came in who got himself a drink and sat down in the corner. Well, everything stopped when he came in because he looked very different from all the people around here, and they knew he was a foreigner of some kind, but they knew not what. Anyway, eventually they forgot him and carried on their chatting, and Jack was doing his usual larking about with the lads and boasting. And they were having a bit of fun and having a little bit of a wager on this and that. And eventually this well-dressed man, foreign man, stranger, came up to him, says, I say, sir, what's your name? He says, well, I'm Jack. Everybody knows me as Jack. He says, well, Jack, you seem to be a lively lad, and you seem to like a wager or two. He says, I do. He says, I do. I can outdo anybody here. Well, he said, how about taking a wager with me? He says, well, okay then. Would you, well, I'm up for anything. Well, said the man, what would you say your best skill is? He says, well, I reckon I'm a pretty good stone thrower. What about you? Well, stone throwing would do fine. Let's have a wager on stone throwing. And yes, we should make it serious. So if you win this wager, you win this bag of gold. And he pulled out from his cloak a bag of gold coins. Well, straight away, Jack stuck his hand in and shook hands on it. That's jolly good. Okay, said Jack, then when shall we do this stone throwing competition? Well, tomorrow morning at 9. And where should we do it? Up at Payne's Pitch on the top of the hill. All right, then we'll do it there. And just as the gentleman was leaving, Jack said, if by chance I don't win, of course, that's not likely to happen, but if by chance I don't win, what's my forfeit then? And he turned round and said, and I will have your soul. And he knew at once this was a serious wager with the devil. So 9 a.m. next morning, they were at top of Payne's Pitch and they were there, and Jack had his special stone, a real beauty, quite heavy, quite dense, very, very smooth. And he was there with the lads, and actually a bit of a crowd had come to watch all this, and so they were waiting around. And then, but no sign of the gentleman who had struck the wager. And they were just at the point of going home, thinking, well, he's not going to turn up. So much for that empty promise of a wager of a bag of gold. And suddenly they heard a cough behind them. There he stood. And so one of the lads said, well, we'd better get this competition started first. So who's going to go first? And Jack said, we'll toss a coin. One of the lads pulled out a coin, flicked it up. You call, heads. Jack won the toss. So Jack said, I think I'll throw second. I'll let you throw first, sir. Well, the devil, he pulls out from his pocket a smooth black stone, so smooth that light just falls into it. He took a couple of steps back, swung his arm, and this stone took off. It took flight. It flew like no other stone, and it flew and flew across the plain and landed splash 5 miles away in the River Severn. Brushed his hands and turned round to Jack and said, think you can beat that? Jack says, well, that's no problem to me. I'm the champion stone thrower around here. He got out his lovely, smooth, heavy stone. He didn't just take a couple of steps back. He took a run, and he took a long run, and he swung his arm, and this stone sailed out like he'd never thrown before. And it went way over the plain and way over the River Severn and landed in a field, throwing up a big cloud of dust. A great cheer went up amongst all his supporters, and he turned round and he says, well, what do you think of that? And at that moment, the devil disappeared, and there was just a bag of gold left on the ground. Now, this all might sound a bit far-fetched, but actually, the place where Jack's stone landed in a field is just by a little village you may know on what is now the A38, and that village is called Stone in honor of that stone. And as for the Devil's Stone, well, that landed in the river, and twice a day the tide comes in, backs up against the stone, and then pushes over to form the Severn Bore.
Fabulous.
No, I think that's a brilliant story. And I
Yeah.
think Disney would do it well. But perhaps we should ask Aardman to do it instead.
Oh, that's, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
But
And
there's
what do
loads
you
of
think?
those stories. Loads of those
There
stories.
are, there really are. And I think, that's really one of the motivations for me capturing some of that in these podcast episodes. And what do you think it is about the Severn in particular that it lends itself so well to this rich, as you say, cultural history?
Yeah. Well, it's a big river, isn't it? I mean, it's a massive river. It's and it goes for such a long distance, and through so many communities, through so many landscapes, and it's part of their folklore and their history and their actual history. The way that the land has been developed in all those places, and yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing all the stuff that happened at Iron Bridge on the Severn, the Industrial Revolution, the heart of the Industrial Revolution on the River Severn. That makes it a massive thing. And I mean, related to that, the Avon, which is a tributary into the Severn at Evesham, so that's not far from where it meets the Severn, was where the first steam-driven boat was built and launched and tested. That's another huge feather in the Severn's cap, I think. And I'm quite interested in, all these little industries. We talked about the fishing, but there was the transport of all the pottery from Worcester, and do you know that the Trow Building Company in Brimscombe, Abdullah Mitchell?
I don't think so.
Right, so they're really interesting, and they made boats, but they made a lot of the Thames River craft that were transported up through the canal, the Thames and Severn Canal, through onto the Thames. But they also made Trows. They also made sectional metal skinned boats. So these were quite large boats, but they were made in sections so that they could be transported down the canal, down to the docks in Sharpness or at Bristol, in these sections, loaded onto ships and taken anywhere in the world. And there's a famous story, the African Queen, and there was a great film about it by Conrad. The book was by Conrad, but the film, and it's all a story about a river boat going up a river in Africa, and all the things that happen on that. And that would have been one of these boats that was made in sections and transported out to Africa. There are still surviving some examples of some of these boats all around the world. There's one in a museum in Tasmania, I understand, and a fire boat. They even transported them up the mountains in the Andes into lakes up
Wow.
because they could be carried on the back of, the sections could be carried, slung between donkeys and carried right up to the I think Lake Titicaca has a Abdullah Mitchell boat on it. Incredible stuff, absolutely incredible stuff, and these were born of being on the Severn, these great things. So I think that's a great, every great river has its stories, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I particularly love the richness of the history of the Severn, and through all periods of time as well, of course, since the earliest settlers of humanity in this very sort of, remote part of northwestern Europe, and when we became an island, and the story of, all of that through to present day can be told on the Severn. And actually, with you being a geologist, it goes much further back than that, because we've got the wonderful Orth's Cliff and Garden Cliff and all of those geological stories in themselves as well, which obviously the landscape, I'm a great believer that the landscape and things tell stories in a way that humans tell stories, but landscape also tells stories, and we've got such a richness of the geology, and also the flora and fauna of the Severn, but also the cultural history. There is so much to unpack. Absolutely agree with you, and I can see, and we are both enraptured by this wonderful river for these reasons.
Yeah, I when I first came, it was on an A-level field trip. So this was 1971, long time ago. And we came over Crickley Hill in a minibus, and we stopped up at the top of Crickley Hill, and we looked out across to Mayhill and across the River Severn. And we'd been talking about the geology all the way up, because we were going up the limestone of the Jurassic, and it's relatively recent, and looking straight across, and the amount of time in building in building that history. So we were looking across at stuff that was twice as old as what we were sitting on. and looking away into the distance, you see the Malverns and the Black Mountains. And I from the back of my house, I can walk up part of the old Cotswold Way to Hesfield Beacon. And so I go up there and I look out, and there's a topograph up there, and you can see on the topograph that it points out the different hilltops. And I'm gradually going around to visit them, and different hills, and you can see as far as Penny Fan, looking west, but looking south, you can see right down to Dunkley Beacon, which is, down on the Somerset coast, 70 miles. And in between, you can make out Steepholm and Flatholm in the Severn Estuary. And you can see the meanders of the River Severn coming up, and the Arlingham Loop, all that, it all just laid out beneath you, and the Severn floodplain. So, and there's a lot of geology, there's a lot of geomorphology there, and it's on that the way we've interacted and utilized the resources is totally dependent. The steep hillsides on the Cotswold side, and to a certain extent on the Forest of Dean side of the valley, they're too steep for arable agriculture. They're really more suited to grazing, and there's a lot of land around here that's best suited for grazing. But then you get down into the sheltered valley with all the river muds and gravels and glacial deposits and things like that, much richer soils, deeper soils, and flatter, much more suited to arable, but also very good dairy country, that is, compared to up on the tops of the hills. And
and of course, one of the main things that was transported up and down the sort of Sharpness to Gloucester Canal was the cream to the Cadbury's factories in.
That's right.
Because there was a Cadbury's factory in Frampton, and lots of the local families have tradition of working in that, because the dairy farming was so good in the area.
Exactly. And you can still, so I still like to ride around the lanes down there. So going down from all the way from Elmore, you got Frampton Seoul, Frampton Severn, Arlingham, and then on down Slimbridge, and all the way down to Oldbury. All along there, you keep finding farms with a Cadbury sign on them, the providing milk for the Cadbury factory. But it's, instead of being taken by canal, it's taken up by tankers these days. But it's still that bit of history, and because it is such good, rich soil, and that's the effect of being a floodplain. And being a floodplain does have its other side, though. There's the story of the tsunami, which came up and swept away a church and various things, medieval times. So there are those dangers, and they do say that if one of the sides of one of the Canary Islands goes, that could send a ripple right the way up, and it would be funneled up the Bristol Channel, and would increase the height of the tsunami. But it is quite a long way. But they do, we saw what happened on that Boxing Day one in Sri Lanka. It went right across the ocean, to cause a tsunami on the other side. So, it could well happen.
And I think the fact that the river is, particularly below Gloucester, is tidal, and so the river that we're familiar with is tidal, makes it a lot more interesting, in terms of, other rivers that are pretty little rivers, and they're very sort of, for the majority of the time, they're very stable, whereas the Severn is incredibly changeable, and obviously it has its dangerous side to it.
Yeah.
But I think, obviously with the Severn Bore and all of those things, it makes it a landscape that's constantly changing, so therefore it's constantly interesting, and I think that's a really one of its major sort of qualities to it. And I think with that has come so much, so the folklore around, as you say, so many different stories about the river and things.
I just found some material on Berkeley, and of course, actually, you'd be interested in this in the Gloucestershire archives in Gloucester. They've got some fantastic old maps, and two I was particularly interested in, one from Minsterworth and one from Berkeley, and showing all the different Berkeley lands, and how they depicted the Severn. The Minsterworth one actually had the Severn clearly going all the way around, but there were bits of, it's quite interesting when you go back quite a while, there'll be bits of one parish and another parish. Like where I live now, I'm in Pitchcombe, and there were bits of Standish parish in Pitchcombe, because the manor at Standish Manor owned some of the small cottages in Pitchcombe. You get those things, but a fascinating map of Berkeley, and there's lots of stories around Berkeley, and of course you've got the drainage, and the drainage of the land around there was a crucial part of improving the land to improve the grazing. And so they put in these well, they're originally things called pills, which are little streams or brooks, but they made artificial ones as well in the levels there, and they've become a part of that landscape, even though they were man-made. They've actually created that landscape, because if it wasn't for them, it would be a lot more boggy, and they wouldn't be farmed so well. A bit like Somerset Levels. Somerset Levels wouldn't exist without the management that was done over hundreds or even thousands of years to achieve that. And when you're looking out, like, that's why I like going up on the Cotswold Ridge and on the Forest of Dean Ridge, and looking down, you can see these ancient aspects to the land management, and where we've now got roads, they would have been unpassable places, and the people would have tried to travel a lot further up the sides of the Vale. It's quite interesting to see. There was a major Roman route discovered up there on the Cotswold side, running down below the ridge along the Severn Vale, but quite away from the water. You either used the water or you had to come a bit inland to be able to make passage. There was just thinking about this, there was there's a bit of folklore in the Berkeley area that actually it wasn't Edward II's body that was carried to Gloucester and laid to rest in the cathedral, that Edward II escaped down the river. So it wasn't Edward II's body that went to Gloucester, but somebody who worked for him, a servant or someone, and that Edward II escaped to a foreign lands. I took some photos the other day that just in Haresfield, just going from Haresfield towards the motorway, there's two massive oak trees, very, very ancient, massive old oak trees that have been trimmed and cut back, and there's a third one which blew over in a storm a few years ago. And these are said to mark the route that Edward II's body took from Berkeley to Gloucester. There's a whole load of other stories around that, but I trying to track down when did this story appear about these oaks and who planted them and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, of course.
And are there any others along that route? And what was the actual route?
Yeah, and my mind goes to the story of St. Arilda. Do you know St. Arilda's church in River Severn?
No.
So it's a very old story, but her remains were dug up from where it's the traditional story of she rebuffed the advances of the local lord, so he beheaded her and she was buried at the well. And of course we know now that often where there was a story of a beheading of the blood in the water, it's actually the algae that turned the water pink in the area. Yeah. This is a common, folk story. And her body was dug up and taken to Gloucester Cathedral because in those days, having a saint or somebody was a real money spinner, and it was a big. She was a big name. Yeah. And then, of course, Edward II then took over as the resident kind of celebrity, and her remains were forgotten, and nobody knows where she was buried. And there's a lot more to that story, but when he was then buried there, that was the major draw for people to go and do pilgrimage and give money to the church there. And so she's a really important character, and a beautiful seven-side church there as well in Albury Severn.
Oh, I know the church. Yeah, I didn't know that story, so that I would go and dig up on it, go and search that one up. Yeah. And every time I go out searching, I find new stories. So I bet if I went along the river to different communities along the river, we would unearth more stories about that.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I think we're losing them probably. We're probably losing them every year.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's that's a real shame. Yeah. But that's what we need to keep doing. We need to keep preserving them and telling those stories and keeping those stories alive, which I'm very passionate about. So no, I mean, thank you very much for coming on and giving us a little bit of the taste of your folklore knowledge of the Severn. It sounds like you've had a real journey from studying the Severn from a geological perspective to then coming into a whole different sort of direction, but almost all of it river determined in some way. It's almost like the Severn has led you along this path. It's incredible.
It keeps cropping up, doesn't it, all the way along. and it's something that draws you to it, isn't it?
Thank you very much for coming on and for giving me your time this evening.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Stephen Rowley for joining me on the podcast. You can find the website GlosTrad online at GlosTrad.com.